Good evening. Here I am in the Whole Foods parking lot in New Hampshire. But guess what? Guess what tonight is? Tonight is the last night of volleyball practice of this season. So this is my last night in New Hampshire in the Whole Foods parking lot. But hey, guess what? Never fear, because the minivan theology just keeps on rolling through all of the events until she gets her driver's license. So yeah, but that's a small victory to be here on the last practice night. Whew, it's been a long time, and it's so bright and sunny. So we are on random verse number 5. If you've been following along, you know I post the verse on Monday. That gives you a couple days if you want to go ahead and try and figure out some context around the verse. And then we meet here on Wednesday. And so I've been going back and forth between the Old and New Testament, but otherwise these are random verses. And so tonight's verse is Ezra 10:4. I'm sure Ezra, popular book. You've all probably been reading it this morning. Okay, maybe not. So Ezra 10:4. Our verse says, "Arise, for it is your task, and we are with you. Be strong and do it." So that's our verse. And I know, like, woo, okay, what's the context? So let's do the postcard rubric that we like to do, and let's get our postcard. So that's our postcard. That's the verse, arise, and that's what it says on the postcard. And from a postcard, we can tell who, what, when. So who wrote this? Who is it written to? What is it that they wrote, and when did they write it? We can tell that from our postcard, right? Our postcard from the Grand Canyon, our postcard from Ezra 10:4. So the book of the Bible is called Ezra because traditionally it's believed to be at least mostly written by Ezra. Way back when these books were first written, Ezra and the next book, Nehemiah, were actually considered one book. They were written as one book. And so it's probably whoever wrote Ezra and Nehemiah was the same person, give or take, and I'll explain a little bit in a minute why we say give or take, but it's a compilation, and the idea is probably that Ezra at least contributed the second half of the book of Ezra. He's writing it to the people of Israel to record their history, to record this is the time period of the people being sent into exile in Babylon and then returning back to the land of Israel to rebuild both the temple and the city. So Ezra focuses more on the rebuilding of the temple when they come back from Babylon, and Nehemiah will focus more on building the city walls of Jerusalem. And so that's what's going on in Ezra and Nehemiah. And so it's from Ezra, and it's to the people of Israel. And so then the what, I love my my genres. This really just is history. So this time we don't get anything super crazy from our ESV study Bible, but it is a little bit more. It's history, but if you've got a kid who takes an AP history class in high school, you've suffered through that horror. In the AP history classes, they have to write an essay, they have to answer some questions, and then they have to support their argument with a few documents. And often the test provides these different documents, and they can link to the documents. Ezra's kind of like an AP Euro or an AP, U.S. history exam, because he includes history, and then he also includes lots of documents such as lists, genealogies, copies of letters. So it's a little not random, but it sort of skips between lists and letters and history. But even our ESV study Bible this time agrees that this is a historical narrative, and that's what we've got going on here for it. Now, the when is where it gets a little confusing, only because Ezra 1 through 6 is written when the first exiles out of Babylon came back and rebuilt. And then Ezra 7 through 10, where our chapters fall, is written about 50 years later when Ezra himself came back to Jerusalem. So there's this interlude in between, probably, by the way, when the book of Esther took place, when it goes from the Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar, and they're conquered by the Persians, and it's Cyrus who comes in and has the Cyrus edict. You can actually go to the museum and see the Cyrus cylinder, and it's written in cuneiform, and it talks about releasing, it doesn't list the Israelites by name, but it talks about releasing the different people that had been sort of in captivity and slavery under him to go back to their lands, to go back to their cults. And so this is, historians believe, an example of the Israelites were one of those people groups that went back to their cult. They would have called it, to rebuild the dwelling place for their God, which in this case is God. And so there's this cool extra biblical piece of the artifact that's out there that you can go see. And so that's all part of the history here. And it took place sort of over this span of it's all BC, but 580 down to 480, somewhere in there, 450 is BC. So that's when it all happened. So that's our postcard. our who and our what and our when. Then we go, okay, that's cool. Let's go check this place out, right? We drive up to the Grand Canyon, we go to the rim, and we take a look around, like, where are we? How did we get here? And that is our where. So here in Ezra 10, it's actually the last chapter of the book. So to really understand what's going on in our verse, we have to sort of understand what came before it. And I've already said that you can really break Ezra up into chapters 1 through 6 and 7 through 10. And there's so much cool history in here. If you are into history, this is a great book to read. The footnotes in the study Bibles are really great, and there's lots of pictures, which if you're into that is pretty cool. You can see all these examples, and you can, some of these things are still over there today, you know, as ruins. So we get to our verse at the end. So remember, the temple had been rebuilt with the first batch of exiles that came back. And by the time Ezra gets there, there's been about 50 years, give or take. And they've already, as the story always goes, they'd already sort of slipped away from worshiping the one true God, even though they'd rebuilt the temple. And they're already falling into the classic sin patterns of idolatry and all of the things that always accompany that. And one of the comments made in the introduction to the book of Ezra in my study Bible I thought was helpful. It says, the Jewish community was struggling to maintain its identity as a people of the Lord as it faced internal and external pressures. So they were allowed to come back. They'd been in captivity for all this time. You know, this is the same captivity period that Daniel was sent away. This is, again, as I said, when Esther became queen. They had all this happen to them in this other land, and then they were finally allowed to come home. They were finally allowed to rebuild the temple, which had been completely destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. And within just a matter of a couple decades, they began to once again lose their identity. And so when Ezra shows up, they come to him and they explain some of the ways that they've had problems maintaining their identity in worshiping the one true God. And the main way that they explain to Ezra that they've messed up, you can see at the beginning of chapter 9, the subtitle is called Ezra Prays About Intermarriage. And they go on to talk about all the ways in which they have married. And I'm looking at chapter 9, it's verse 1. They mention all of the different people groups that they've married into: the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Egyptians, and the Amorites, so forth and so on, all the ites. And so because of that, they started worshiping their pagan gods. I mean, it's the classic cycle. It's the classic cycle that always happens. And so that's where we find ourselves here at the very end of chapter 10. Our verse is actually the people coming to Ezra and confessing that they've once again stopped worshiping God alone, and they've incorporated worship to pagan gods through marrying into people groups that worship other gods. And they say to him, we have to go back a verse or two, they say to Ezra, we have broken faith with our God, therefore let us make a covenant with our God to put away their wives and children according to the counsel of my Lord and all those who tremble at the commandment of our God. And then they say to Ezra, arise, for it is your task, we are with you, be strong and do it. So basically they're telling Ezra, tell us what we need to do to get right with God because we've messed up through all this intermarriage. Now, I'm just going to pause because I know that sounds terrible and heartless that they're going to say all these wives and children, we're going to put them away. And this is where having a good study Bible is really important. If you go down into the study notes for verse 4 and the few verses before it, 2 and 3, and you read about what it means when it says put away, or it's down here in the elf-size font, or the marriage, it's not the same word that is used. And this is just in my footnotes right here. Like, you don't have to know anything special about Hebrew or Greek or anything like that. It says in the footnotes that the words used for putting away or this marriage are not actually the words that the Bible uses for marriage or divorce. So they think what they really mean here is they were living with these other people groups. They were living with women who were Moabites and Egyptians and all of that. They weren't necessarily marrying them, and they were just going to return them back to their people where they come from. Now, the big thing here is God's not heartless. He's not saying, oh, you married that and now she's cast off and it's all her. That's not what's going on here. And we know that because we have these stories in the Bible earlier than Ezra, but happening, just a couple hundred years before. We have Rahab in the city of Jericho who warns the spies about what's coming and how to evade capture. And then she marries in to the nation of Israel. She marries one of the two spies that comes in, and she becomes the great-grandmother of David, who would go on to become King David. And then we have Ruth, who is actually Rahab's great granddaughter through marriage, and she is a Moabite, one of the people listed in this group right here. And she comes in, and remember, she doesn't desert her mother-in-law Naomi. She stays with her, and she ends up marrying Boaz, and they have the grandfather of of David also. So both of them are mentioned in Jesus's lineage. The Bible is not saying, Ezra is not saying, the Old Testament is not saying that these women are no good and they're worthless. What they are saying is when you come into the nation of Israel, you're coming into the faith. You're coming into the belief and the understanding that there is one true God. And that takes us back to the Ten Commandments. The first two of the Ten Commandments is there's one God, you shall have no other gods before me. And the second commandment is do not make idols. And so every single time that we've talked about this in minivan theology, we've seen that every time people begin to incorporate pagan idolatry or bring in idolatry into their homes, into their marriages, instead of people coming in and saying that they're one true God and worshiping God, it goes badly. It's the same mistake over and over and over and over and over. Okay, so remember that, because here we are at the rim looking around and we're saying, okay, this is a verse about Ezra telling them what to do to make this right with God. It's going to be to return these women and children probably back to the people groups they came from, if they're not going to follow the one true God, to get rid of the idols. And so now let's take a little hike down to that canyon. What does that have to do with us today? This happened, in like 400 BC. There's gonna be like 400 years or so, and then Jesus is gonna come. The temple is gonna get destroyed another time in 70, and it's not even, there's not even a temple there now. There's just a Temple Mount. So who really cares what's going on here? Here's why it matters to us today. And this is our why going down into the canyon. Because it's the same thing. When we talk about this cycle over and over and over, this idea of idolatry, it's the same problem that we have today. There's a well-known guy in Churchland. You may know him, you may not know him. His name is Tim Keller. And he has a quote on idolatry. And he says, an idol is anything that's more important to you than God. It could be anything. It could be the degree, it could be the job, it could be your kids, it could be your health. It could be anything that's more important to you than God is an idol. So it's no different today here in 2023 than it was for the Israelites talking to Ezra back then in 480 BC. It's no different. We still have the same problems. We still keep putting something other than God first. And if that means that the friends you're hanging out with, or the people that you're working with, or the person that you're dating, if they are leading you that way instead of you leading them towards the one true God, then that's the wrong direction. And that's what was happening here with the Israelites. Only 50 years after they made this big thing about rebuilding the temple. It doesn't take any time at all. It just happens that quickly if you're not guarding your heart, if you're not following God and having Him, give you His life and His heart. And so that's why our verse way back here in Ezra matters to us. And it's so easy just to sort of see this as an interesting book in the Old Testament. There's a lot of cool history, and there's a lot of artifacts that you can go into museums and see, and see that it's not a living story. But we know that this whole Bible is one story, right? And here we go. It's one story from beginning to end, and there's one main character. And who is it? It's not us. It's God, and He invites us into His story. And so this this is a cautionary story for us to not be distracted from the most important thing in our life, which should be the main character of this story. The main character of this story is the most important thing in our life. And if it's not, anything else short of that is an idol, and it's going to lead to the same place that it led to for these people in the time of Ezra. All right, so that's our verse from Ezra 10:4, and next week we're going to be doing some New Testament again, but I've got a live studio audience again. Everybody say hello to Abby back there doing her homework. I actually have a whole human person here. All right, good night everyone.